My name is Damon and I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Damon.
I was born uncomfortable. And basically things got worse from there. That was in the spring of 1968 right here in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up on the southeast side. My mother back then was a 32-year-old banquet waitress at the Hyatt Regency downtown. My father was a 49-year-old union iron worker and a certified welder with the local 387 here in Atlanta. He was also a heroin addict. And so both of my parents were definite city dwellers, but with a country background. So I guess you could say that my socioeconomic status, as well as much of my personality, falls somewhere between ghetto and get her done. My life was basically unremarkable from birth till about 8 years old. At 8 years old, two things would happen that would forever alter the course of my life. The first one was the first time I ever got drunk. I was off with one of my older brothers, and we were at my oldest brother's house, and everybody was passing around a bottle of brown liquor, chasing it with a Sprite, and I was watching them, and they were watching me, and I guess I had that look that a little brother has when he looks at his older brothers. I kind of want to join in and be a part of that. So I remember them looking at each other and smiling and handing me that bottle. And I took a big old swig of it and chased it down with that Sprite. It come around again and I hit it one more time. And the last thing I remember is laying over in the bushes, throwing up. And my sister-in-law coming up to me with a cold rag, wiping my forehead off and saying, "It's going to be all right." It took a long time for it to get all right. The second thing that happened that would alter the course of my life is my mother and my stepfather, my parents were divorced by then, decided they were going to pursue the American dream and provide a better life for their kids than they had. So they decided to move out of the mean old city of Atlanta down south to a little town called Monticello. And while it is true that the big cities hold more danger, some of those small towns are pretty hotbeds for activity too. When we moved in there, the first two guys I met were the local juvenile delinquents. And one of them was a couple of years older than me. His name was Steve, and he was not that bad. The other one probably was 4, maybe 5 years older than me. His name was David, and he was into all kind of stuff. This is back in the 1970s, and we were living on a lake. A lot of people come there for the weekend, and their houses are empty, so it didn't take him long to figure out that I was small enough to slide in those little accordion things next to the window air conditions. And so we would go there, and he would slide that thing back, push me up in there, and I'd go around, open the door, and we'd go in those houses and steal whatever we could. And of course, when you're doing that kind of stuff in a small town, it don't take long for the police to start appearing in your driveway over at your house. And so we were in trouble, and they were catching us. And that thing rocked on probably till I was about 11 years old. And then me and old David, we cooked up one of our better schemes where I was going to tell my mother that I was going to stay with my father that weekend in Atlanta. And I was going to tell my father that I was going to stay down with my mother at the lake, and really me and David were going to run off for the weekend to Monticello. And that's what we did. He told me to go in there and steal my mother's pills. Now, she had nerve pills. And he told me to steal her pistol, and I did. And me and him left and got away with it. And that night we were walking down the highway, heading toward Monticello, and the local sheriff, his name was Arthur Gordon. I won't never forget it. He drove by. As soon as he seen us, he knew it was going to be larceny in motion. So me and David took off running down through the woods, And when we got down there, he handed me the pills and he handed me the pistol, and he said, "Don't you come out of here unless I come down here and get you." And he goes back up there, and him and Arthur Gordon stand on the side of the road, and they're both calling my name, but he never walked back down there, and I never raised up and went out of there. So finally they left, and there I was on the side of the highway, 11 years old, peeled up, nowhere to go. So I turned around and headed back home. And when I got there and knocked on that door, my mother took one look at me and took me to the hospital and had my stomach pumped out. And the next morning, when I woke up, she was still asleep. I went outside where I had hid them pills and that pistol. And I got the pistol and I was in the bathroom playing with it when she opened the door. And I guess with the pressure of all that had happened, maybe she snapped a little bit, but she gave me one of them 1970s style ass whoopings. Y'all remember them? Anybody in here old enough to remember them? I know Willie does. And the next day, instead of going to school, I went around the corner to my friend's house and used his telephone to call my daddy up here in Atlanta, and I told him that basically Mama done down there trying to kill me. And him and my grandmother came down there, took me over to the social services office, showed them little whelps on my behind. They granted him temporary custody, and that's when I moved back to Atlanta. Now, I told you earlier that my daddy was no heroin addict, and he was. He spent much of his life in prison. In 1971, when I was 3 years old, he got a hold of some bad heroin, blew his right arm up, and that prompted him, after a lifetime of that, to get on methadone. So when I moved in with him at 11 years old, I never knew about his history. I never knew about the stuff he had done. But when I got in there, I started finding out, because he was on methadone, and that took him off the heroin, and that kept him from going to prison. But he's just an old hustler, and he sold pills on the side, and he did a little bit of this, and he did a little bit of that. And so after my grandmother died, he started really kind of ramping things up at our house. And I guess I led like a dual lifestyle, because in a lot of ways I was an ordinary 11-year-old, 12-year-old child. But in other ways, I had access to the darker side of life, because I began to learn what pills were and how to sell them and make money. He would say things like, "All right, so-and-so's going to come by here, and I want you to give him 3 of these. And he's going to give you X amount of dollars." It would be K4 Dilaudids, 50 or 100 milligram Demerol. Sometimes it would be speed pills. Back then we got our speed from the doctor. It was pharmaceutical. Pills called Dizoxin, Preludin. And I learned about all this stuff. And I learned that his friends that he had, all of them had a history. Old Cree Jones, he did 5 years at the end of Boulevard in federal prison. Old John Smith, he was a safe cracker back in the 50s. And all this stuff fascinated me, and I wanted to know more about it. And so I learned. By the time I was 13, my mother had moved back to Atlanta, to her house over on Key Road. And I started going back and forth between my daddy's house and my mama's house. And I've always had a pattern of finding the wrong kind of people. I mean, I could be at the new Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and there could only be one other junkie in the house. But when I got up to go to the bathroom, he'd be standing next to me, asking me if I got anything. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's just how it has been for me my whole life. So when I got back hanging around over my mother's neighborhood, I started running with an older crowd, real junkies. And I was so small when I was 13. They used to treat me like a kid. And I'd hang out with them, but when they got ready to shoot some dope, they'd make me sit on the back of the car, or they'd make me go in the other room. And the whole while this is going on, I'm helping my daddy run his pill business. And so finally I got pissed off and told him, I said, "You know, I can get more dope than any one of y'all can. Take me to my house." And so they did. I went in there and I stole some 15 milligram Dizoxins off the coffee table where my daddy kept a bottle. And we went into a basement over in Mama's neighborhood, and I held out my arm and they gave me that first shot of speed. Now, y'all have heard in the history books about the shot that was heard around the world? I don't know about that. But that first shot of speed rocked my world. Not long after that, I started needing a whole lot more money and a whole lot more drugs, and things just escalated. Finally, what brought it all to a head was Creed Jones and my daddy kept the stash money at his house that they bought the pills with, and I knew where it was at. And I stole it. And it took me about a week to spend it. And by then, my daddy had figured out what happened to it. And when he finally cornered me up, I tried to blame it on my old uncle that had paroled to his house. But when he finally cornered me up, I was at a motel over on Old Dixie. And I got away from him and snuck out of there, but he called my mama and told my mama he couldn't take it no more, to come and get me. And so she did. And by then, I was strung out, for real strung out. And so I spent my teenage years in and out of adolescent treatment centers. By then, she'd went to work for General Motors, so she had some pretty good insurance. I was in a place called Peachtree in Parkwood 4 times. I was in numerous outpatient programs over at South DeKalb. Finally, I ended up at an outdoor therapeutic program in Brunswick, Georgia called Youth Estate. I stayed there a year. By the time I was 17, I got with some of those same people, and we were kicking in doors to get money for drugs. Of course, we got caught. I got probation. I violated that probation, and they sent me down to the YDC in Milledgeville, Georgia. And I spent 4 months down there, and I didn't like it. I'm going to tell you right now, I didn't like it. It wasn't nothing like those treatment center hospitals I had been in or the outdoor therapeutic program. Milledgeville YDC in 1985 was not a pleasant place. So when I got out of there, I decided to try and get myself together. I was living down the street from my mother not long after I turned 18. My girlfriend was living with me. It was with a family friend. My mother was basically paying my rent. One morning she stopped down there and she said, "Son, you need to do something different than you've been doing." And I was like, "What's that, Ma?" She said, "You need to join the military." I said, "Them people ain't gonna take me." She said, "Try." And so I went down to Airhead Shopping Center to the Navy recruiting office, and then the next thing you know, I'm on an aircraft carrier, floating in the Mediterranean. I spent 7 years in the Navy, and I did what a lot of drug addicts do. I had sense enough to know that I couldn't shoot dope every day in the United States Navy and get away with it. So I started drinking. Now, from that first time I got drunk at 8 until I was 18, I didn't have a taste for alcohol. That first real sick spell got to me. I just never did like it through my teenage years. But when I got in the Navy, and they sent me up to school in Millington, Tennessee, back then if you had a military ID card, you could reach the counter, you could buy booze. I started stopping by the store, getting me an 8-pack of those little pony beers. Pretty soon I graduated to a pint of Smirnoff. And then I basically drank every day the whole time I was in the military, unless I was on a ship overseas. And I'm going to tell you something, alcohol beat me down. It's not like shooting dope, smoking crack, which is going to take you down just as fast as it can. Alcohol will stretch you on out there for a long time. Alcohol will keep you on that treadmill for a while. And I was a functioning alcoholic. I'd get drunk every night, go to work every day. Get drunk every night, go to work every day. So anyway, by the time my 7th year rolled around, on my 2nd enlistment, I got out. Basically, the Navy was tired of me and I was tired of them. When I got back to Atlanta, I had drank myself into such a condition, I was glad to get back on dope. I was like, thank you. Now, up to that point, I just thought I had been in trouble. Not long after I got out of the Navy, I got a DUI. I done had a couple down in Florida. And so the judge sentenced me to 12 months on that DUI in a work release program. And basically what happened is they told me to go out to jail and take a right and go around to the work release place. I took a left, and about a week later, they caught me over at my girlfriend's house. They gave me a year for felony escape on that one. Sent me to a prison boot camp up in Beaufort. And while I was in there, I decided that when I got out, I was going to sell more drugs than anybody else. My second trip to prison was for pursuing that goal. They caught me with a little bit of dope, this, that, and the other. They gave me 3 years on that sentence. I went down the road, did 26 months, and when I got out, I decided that I was going to be more careful this time. The next time they caught me, I was coming out of Griffin with a whole bunch of methamphetamine. It would be my 4th drug offense. They gave me 20 years on that one to serve. And I went to prison, and this time, I think I came as close as I possibly could to surrender. I did 6 years and 8 months on that sentence. When I was at a camp that had AA, I went. I went to church. Anything that could possibly change my life, I was for it. Then, at 6 years and 8 months, I got out, and I got really involved in AA, and I started trying to do the right thing outside of prison. Now, I'm going to say this. Anybody that accumulates clean time in prison, it counts, okay? It counts. But it's not the same. I recommend now to anybody that gets out of prison, I don't care if you did 1 year or 20 years, treat that first year out like it's your first year of sobriety. Work for that first year of sobriety just like you would if you were coming straight out of the dope trap or straight out of the liquor house. I didn't do that. I had a little over 7 years clean the first time I ever came to the Decatur Square meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was on the MARTA bus one day, met this girl. She was a home group member over here. She said, "I'm in recovery." I said, "I am too." She said, "You want to go to a meeting?" I said, "Yeah." So she brought me over here. There was a lady that sat right by the door for like 2 decades. Her name was Miss Marie. So when I come in the door, she says to that girl, she said, "Who's your friend?" She said, "This is Damon." She said, "How long you been clean?" I said, "A little over 7 years." She said, "You want to tell your story?" I said, "Yeah." I got to the part where I just got out of prison, her mouth dropped open, you know what I mean? And that started my journey here at Decatur Square. I made it 9 months after I got out. I relapsed. It took me 5 years to get back. I was in and out of this meeting, just like he said when he introduced me. I would come in, but not all the way in. I would sit down, but not all the way down. And I'd go back out. Sometimes Miss Marie would look at me. One night I was over here and she said, "Hey, after the meeting, I want you to put my name and phone number on a little piece of paper and put it in your billfold." I said, "Okay, what for?" She said, "That way when they find you dead in the gutter, they'll have somebody to call." She'd talk to me and say things, and I'd be in and out, in and out. Finally, on October the 10th of 2010, I came into this AA meeting, and for the first time in my whole career, I came all the way in and I sat all the way down. And by that I mean I was tired. Finally, after all of that, tired. And I wanted something different. So Miss Marie looked at me and she said, "I think Walter will make you a good sponsor." I said, "Okay." Big black fella back there became my sponsor. And her longtime boyfriend, we buried him a few years ago. He said, "I think you need to start finding speakers for this meeting." And I said, "Okay." And that's how you can tell if somebody's ready to get sober. When you ask them to do something, they say, "Okay." Not "okay, but," or "let me think about it." And I just did what people told me to do. And I didn't realize it at the time, but his name was Don. He knew that he was doing something for me that I couldn't do for myself. Back then I was an automotive technician and I wore a uniform every day with my name on it. And to find speakers for this meeting every week, whoever's doing it now, it's not an easy task. And you got to stay on it. and it gets you out. So I was all around Atlanta finding these speakers, and people were getting to know me, and they automatically do my name because it was right there on my shirt. I'd be on the MARTA bus. I didn't have no license back then. I'd be on the MARTA bus, and people be saying, "Hey, Damon." I'd be like, they all knew me. And it was recovery people. And all of that kind of stuff plays in to helping us get sober and stay sober. Okay? I didn't realize all of that then. But I like to call my first year of sobriety the best, worst year of my life. Because it's not easy. It's not easy getting sober. Finally, I got up to a year, and I remember one of the white chips I picked up. I had picked up so many in here. Miss Marie looked at me and said, "You know, they're 29 cents a piece now." Because I picked up a bunch of white chips. But finally, I made it up to that blue chip, man. And I celebrated my first, second, maybe even my third year of sobriety here with Decatur Square. My home group's now down the street at the Ponce group. To say that my life is different now would be like an understatement. Because I went through the whole process. And everywhere I go now, there's people that have impacted my life in ways that I could have never thought of. I could have never imagined it. I didn't even realize it was happening. Me and Walter are still good friends, have been good friends for the whole time. And that's the kind of friends you make in AA. Real friends. You might not see them every day, you might not talk to them every day, but they know that they can depend on me and I can depend on them. Walter knows if he calls me in the middle of the night, I'm going to go get him. Same I know about him. It says in the literature that we are a group of people that normally would not mix. But in spite of our differences, there exists among us a friendliness and a fellowship and an understanding that is indescribably wonderful. And when I look back over my life of doing drugs and drinking, that's what I was after, man. I was after that friendliness and that fellowship and that understanding that is so wonderful. For a long time, I thought I found it in a bar. For a long time, I thought I found it in shooting speed. For a long time, I thought I found it in just girlfriend after girlfriend or this after that or any of that. But that's not where it's at. And see, AA replaces that with something that's real. All of that stuff is fake. I've been married 2 times and never could make a relationship work. Funny thing happened to me in AA. When I first started coming to this group, there was this cute girl that used to come here with me. We'd look at each other across the room. And so for that whole first year, we kept looking at each other, smiling. At a year, we started dating. At 2 years, we moved in together. At 8 years sober, and I like to remind her, I did come into the program a month and a half before she did, so I got like a vast amount of more experience. But we've got a wonderful, good life together today, all right? When we started dating, we rode the MARTA bus on our first date. Neither one of us had a driver's license or a car. We both went through the progression of apartment to buying a house, to getting better jobs, to just building the kind of life that AA provides. Not that the better life is in the promises, okay? It's just like a byproduct of sobriety. What AA gives us is freedom from alcohol, a daily reprieve. But I heard somebody say one time, I didn't get in trouble every time I got drunk. But every time I got in trouble, I was drunk. So when you take the alcohol or the drugs out of the equation, life gets better. These days, what my life is like, I got some guys I sponsor. I share my experience and my strength and my hope with them. I don't tell them nothing new. I hadn't had an original thought my whole life. I tell them what somebody has told me in recovery. And it works. It really works. When I'm struggling or things ain't going my way, or life feels like an uphill battle, I remind myself what it was like on the last day. I remind myself of how I had been up for several days doing methamphetamine. And how on that Sunday morning on October the 10th, at about daylight, I had to drink 6 or 7 beers just to slow my mind down enough so I could even think about how much trouble I was in. And how God Himself gave me a moment of clarity on that day. How I was sitting in my mother's front yard, how I had just left the halfway house and been out on a binge for 3 or 4 days. And how I was sitting there and I had about $400 in my pocket. All right? And how I picked up the phone and called the halfway house lady instead of the dope man. Huh? And how I told her, you know what, I don't want to come back over there, but if you'll send somebody to get me, I will. And damn if she didn't, man. And that's how circumstances, like it says in the book, circumstances made me believe. Then I knew. When you look back over the history of AA, you'll see all these little situations. It could have went either way. It could have did this. It could have did that. It's the same way with our life. There's a power greater than us that is in charge. And it's my job to remember that I ain't him. Okay? It's my job to remember last time I was in charge, they had a guy standing in a tower with a high-powered rifle, keeping me from going to the liquor store or the dope trap. And I called that sobriety, all right? That wasn't sobriety. That was me being locked away and couldn't get none, all right? Sobriety is where we learn how not to get high or drunk when nobody's looking. Sobriety is learning how to do the next right thing in spite of how I feel or what's going on or any of that kind of stuff. Now, I'm going to close with this. If you're in this room today and you feel like you're hopeless, or maybe you got just a little while, keep coming back. Keep coming back. Because there's people all around you that have been right where you're at. And if they made it, you can make it. Thank you.